Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your early morning briefing for Thursday, the 24th of July, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby, and let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway. Robert, good morning. I've noticed that the House and Senate now, I think 2 weeks in a row, have had hearings on the drone threat. Last week, the House had a hearing, and you had the panelists providing testimony talk about the rise in drone incursions over military bases, over critical infrastructure, power plants. Is really They really laid out an astounding amount of vulnerabilities. I think one of the biggest problems they're having, just briefly, is identifying what could be friendly drones or drones that have an official capacity and drones that are unknown or maybe a threat. And one of the things they're talking about doing is how to enable local authorities to tag some of these drones with there are three things: friendly, unknown, or hostile. And of course, if a drone for whatever reason is labeled as hostile, then the feds have to come in. They're talking about pushing basically anti-drone weapons down to the state and maybe local level to help, I guess, start bringing some of these drones down. With that in the background, a DHS official said a drone attack on the border is only a matter of time, which is also very concerning. So what happened there?
So this was a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing that happened on Tuesday, and this was testimony from Deputy Director of Homeland Security Stephen Willoughby. He's the head of DHS's counter drone program, and he pointed out that there was a significant and it's very significant increase in drone incursions on the border last year. I think he said something like 60,000 flights in the last half of 2024. And he said that the cartels have already been using weaponized drones against each other. And he says it's only a matter of time before they start using those weaponized drones, potentially on U.S. law enforcement on the border.
Mm-hmm. So that was the big takeaway from that House hearing as well. These drones moving from reconnaissance to potentially, eventually, an attack. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on to this. Think about Ghislaine Maxwell. She's scheduled. The House Republicans have, House Oversight, I'm not sure if that's Republicans, has scheduled Ghislaine Maxwell to testify coming up in August.
Yeah, House Oversight Chair James Comer issued a subpoena for Ghislaine Maxwell yesterday, and they did schedule that deposition for the 11th of August. I did see, interestingly, constitutional scholar Jonathan Turley said yesterday that he talked to Maxwell's legal representation and that they claim she was actually never even interviewed by any local or federal authorities at any point in time during her criminal trial.
Mm-hmm. So could we see some gotcha moments where obviously Democrats are going to use their time to ask about Trump and maybe some other things? Also, I was just reading an article, I don't even remember where it was, but they said that Ghislaine Maxwell was kind of like the mastermind of this whole thing. She's actually worse than Epstein in that regard. If you are, and I say this because yesterday the Department of Justice came out and said Trump is named in the Epstein files. And we don't know anything more than that, I don't think. But I guess we're going to find out maybe on August 11th.
Yeah, I do think that Democrats are going to use this hearing for that. That's having read a lot of these hearings and listened to a lot of them. That is one of the main reasons these hearings are held by either party. They bring witnesses that they think are favorable to whatever they're trying to do in that hearing. I expect Democrats are going to probably have witnesses in the hearing as well. And the questions will be focused on, I think, the President Trump and trying to further this narrative or their political strategy to tie Trump to the Epstein files to try to drag down some of his polling.
Mm-hmm. Now, Comer is a Republican from Kentucky, so this is a little bit surprising that, it seems to me like it's pretty high risk, maybe, unless Maxwell's prepared to say that Trump was named because he was at a birthday party with Epstein and did not go to the island. But it seems like extremely high risk for Republicans here.
Yeah, well, there were one of the judiciary subcommittees. They voted to issue the subpoena, and there were a couple of Republicans who joined Democrats to actually get that subpoena done.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, and in the comments, a great time to remind everyone the Epstein files actually don't exist. I say that tongue in cheek, obviously. All right, let's move on to something a lot better, which is talking about U.S. Mexico cooperation, security cooperation. I read this morning, Robert, and this is really good news.
Yeah, Mexico's Security Minister Omar Garcia Harfuch, he said that Mexican and U.S. authorities have been cooperating across the border on a search for violent criminals, and this is part of an ongoing bilateral security cooperation agreement. And he did say during this press conference that so far they held a major operation. I think they said 2,800 Mexican law enforcement officials were mobilized in 14 cities, and they arrested 48 suspects that were involved with the Michoacan cartel. They said this was basically an extortion network that's been operating across the country.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've noticed a pretty big pivot in security cooperation in Latin America, which is important because if we can maybe help solve some of the problems down there, we will maybe lessen some of the problems we have here, number one. But also, I would just remind everyone the previous Mexican president, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, or AMLO, basically sidelined DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, from a lot of the counter narco operations in Mexico. And that was probably because DEA was a little too close to the fire, maybe a little too close to linking AMLO directly with cartel involvement. However, the current president is AMLO's successor and protege, Claudia Sheinbaum. So this is actually some pretty good news here, seeing increased U.S. and Mexico cooperation. And I guess Mexico really does not like the idea of having those tariffs. So more carrot and stick here from the Trump administration. Thanks for bringing that up, Robert. And then finally, let's talk about this thing. This started last week. Apparently, President Trump was on a phone call with some Texas Republicans, encouraging them to do this mid-decade redistricting. And apparently, Texas Republicans may be going along with that.
Yeah, this is a special session that Texas Governor Greg Abbott called for this week. And Republicans in the state of Texas are trying to use this to push for a new congressional district map. And as far as I understand, they expect that a new map ahead of the 2026 election would give them 5 additional seats in Texas. And the Democratic response coming from Gene Wu, who's the head of the Texas House Democrats and a state rep from Houston, he said that all options are on the table, including Democrats fleeing the state to break a quorum in the Texas state legislature.
Mm-hmm. Gene Wu is an interesting fellow. I follow him on X because he is kind of the voice in a way for Texas Democrats. You know, I seem to recall this actually happened in Oregon, but the other way around. You had Republicans leaving the state just to break that quorum so Democrats could not pass a bill. I don't recall what it was, maybe an anti-gun bill. And the state threatened to send bailiffs after them, basically saying, hey, we're going to arrest you if you don't come back. So I guess Gene Wu is saying we could see that repeat here in Texas.
Yeah, and that's something that has happened actually pretty commonly in American history. Whenever there's been a bill that a party disagrees, a minority party within the state legislature disagrees with, this is not the first, or the Oregon example is not the first time that lawmakers have fled a state in order to break a quorum.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we may be seeing another showdown in Austin. I'm here for it. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on to the global sit rep. And Jared, this is another thing we have talked about over the past few weeks, is the amount of support for Israel just claiming or exerting their sovereignty over the West Bank fully. And so they're effectively doing this with Gaza.
Yep. So
correct?
we talked
West
about
Bank.
some absolutely. We talked about some former Israeli government officials saying, "Hey, government, you need to do this. Get on it." And now the Israeli legislature has approved a motion to declare sovereignty over the West Bank. They use their legal names for it, Judea, Samaria, and the Jordan Valley. But the legislatures were careful to say, hey, right now this carries no legal weight, but it reflects the national aspiration to realize the return to Zion, which is that's expansionist, quite frankly. That moves the borders of the recognized borders of Israel. They also called on the Israeli government, namely Netanyahu, to transform vision into reality. Say, hey, add the legal weight to it. Get this done. They're pushing for it. It is trending toward a legal recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the entire West Bank.
Mm-hmm. And I guess the risk here is, number one, you make some Arab neighbors angry, but also, could we see the Israelis just basically clear out the West Bank of Palestinians for Israeli settlers?
I was considering that. Realistically, I don't think it's all that different in nature from the Operation Gideon's Chariots, where they said we're going to clear out Gaza, and just no, you will not be here. We're going to make. I think we covered 22 new settlements planned inside of Gaza. It was just moving them out. I don't see why they wouldn't perform a similar operation once they have their legal standing for clearing to declare sovereignty over the West Bank.
Mm-hmm. Also, the Israelis have talked about annexing parts of southern Syria, and the point is, lots of national boundaries are going to get redrawn here over the next couple decades. I think we've already seen that to a degree, but probably going to happen with a lot more intensity probably coming up. All right, thanks. And speaking of that, let's go ahead and, Jared, I'll just let you take it from here, but this is interesting. Vietnam, just remind us before you start. Vietnam, it does seem like they have a sense of neutrality, but on the one hand, they're being bullied constantly by China, but also they're so small and so close to China that they really can't just pivot fully to the United States, even maybe if some leadership wanted to. Would you say that's an accurate characterization?
Pretty accurate. I would say that gets about probably 90% of how I view it, with the additional caveat that Vietnam doesn't necessarily like the United States, but it dislikes China more than it dislikes the United States.
Mm-hmm. So Vietnam is a communist country still as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But to that end, they do have to try to appear neutral because, yes, they have effectively the superpower of the region literally bordering them. The really skinny country on the coast there, actually, for this map, not about this piece, but you can see that is Vietnam touching China. Like, they are right there, and they've had a border war with them. But China and Vietnam began what they're calling their first ever China-Vietnam Joint Army Training yesterday. Now, this exercise is taking place near the China-Vietnam border on the Chinese side, and they're saying it focuses on joint reconnaissance, joint strikes, joint rescue, and joint support. Basically, they're trying to do an integration of forces. Now, given the heavily neutral stance, I don't know if that's Vietnam trying to play to China's good side or trying to figure out how the Chinese operate in the modern era, or if they are truly just integrating with the Chinese. I'm not sure how they're playing that, but there are a bunch of different ways I could try to understand this. As we go forward, I will try to actually get a better picture of what Vietnam's even doing with this here, because it doesn't make sense that if your main security threat is there, you would want to actually integrate with them.
Yeah, this is interesting because it's not unusual to see these countries do military exercises involving disaster relief, humanitarian aid, maritime security. But just to reiterate, this is China and Vietnam conducting joint reconnaissance, joint strikes, and other joint support functions, which are warfighting functions.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. Thanks for that, Jared.
Yep. And moving just to the other side of Vietnam. So Thailand and Cambodia, per the U.S. Embassy in Thailand, exchanged rocket and artillery fighter along their border last night. And the Thai government is evacuating what the embassy called certain areas. I did not see what areas exactly were being cleared out there, but they are conducting evacuations. This is a developing situation, so I'll continue to monitor and report, especially as Cambodia's primarily aligned with China, and Thailand is a major non-NATO ally for the United States. They're on opposite sides of the geopolitical, power structure, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there on the map, Thailand's in blue, Cambodia's in red.
Yep.
All
Sorry,
right.
those labels are a little hard to read.
There are a few questions about Thailand and Cambodia, and we will get to them during the Q&A portion. For now, let's also talk about, speaking of a major non-NATO ally that is or has been Colombia in the past, and there's a surprising amount of support, it seems, from Democrats to actually cut some foreign aid that's going to Colombia because they are pivoting towards China, or at least they say they are.
Yes. So, yeah, the House of Representatives allocated $209 million in support for Colombia for fiscal year 2026, which is about half of what it had in fiscal year 2025. And one particularly interesting quote that came out of that hearing was Representative Cuellar, a Democrat from Texas, saying we cannot send money to a country that does not take positions with the United States. So, hey, you didn't support us on immigration. You're not supporting us on the Panama stuff. You're not, you're siding with Venezuela. Yeah, we're starting to cut you off, which you're pretty fond recently of saying carrot and stick. Here's the stick.
Yeah, this is a new era. And again, this goes back to my conversation with Michael Every back in May, this whole concept of statecraft, which it's a lot of things, but it's economic statecraft. It's using economic levers. It's using all levers to not only reshape the United States, but reshape the broader region, and eventually using statecraft to reshape the world to maintain that U.S. favor. Yeah. I would say, obviously, the big risk is that this is viewed as punitive and, not a, it could be viewed as punitive and really force the Colombians much closer to China. But I would just add, Colombia does have a presidential election coming up. So maybe there's some light at the end of the tunnel, and the Colombian people realize, hey, if we want continued bucks from Uncle Sam, we don't need to elect a leftist for president. Yeah. I don't know. Keep your fingers crossed, maybe. All right. And then, go ahead.
Well, I do want to say that a pretty significant portion of the support that the U.S. regularly gives to Colombia is for supporting their military.
For security, absolutely.
So, they actually have it bifurcated, military and security forces. So they get a lot of funding for that. You could see Colombia's domestic situation get really hairy here as they, ramp down funding. I don't think that will necessarily drive them to China, even though it will definitely be seen as punitive. Because what is China going to support you with hundreds of millions of dollars? Like
probably not since 2022.
Yeah.
By the way, that's when China really started to cut off Latin American funding. Also, yeah, a lot of our security efforts with Colombia have to do with combating organized crime, really the counter narco operations, foreign internal defense kind of stuff. I would hate to see a lot of extremely good progress made in Colombia be reversed, but everyone makes their own decisions. All right, finally, let's go back to Europe. This back and forth between the EU and China. What's going on?
Absolutely. So this is coming out of a meeting between European Union President Ursula von der Leyen and Chinese President Xi Jinping. The EU president told Xi Jinping at a meeting yesterday that the EU-China relationship has, quote, reached an inflection point, and that rebalancing our bilateral relation is no longer optional. It is essential. Von der Leyen went on to describe the relationship's sustainability as something to be achieved, indicating that, hey, as it stands, this is not sustainable. We cannot sustain this. It will have to break or be fixed. Now, that could only happen, per von der Leyen, if China would acknowledge our respective concerns and come forward with real solutions. Basically, stop flooding our markets. Stop, really start buying EU goods again. That's what they're getting at. Those are the EU's main issues. Is China looks to flood the EU market with any kind of subsidized goods they can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a pretty bad deal for the EU. Just reading this morning, there are 13 million Europeans who work in the auto production sector, auto manufacturing. And it's kind of hard to keep people employed when China's flooding your markets with relatively cheap electric vehicles, especially at a time when, you look at a country like Hungary, it's trying to be kind of the auto manufacturing hub for Europe. It's hard for them to compete. Hungary in China are their own deal as well. We won't get into it now, but anything to add there, Jared?
No.
Okay. All right, thanks for that. Let's go ahead and move on. 62 protests today. As a reminder, we do track these protests every day, not only from the big protest organizations, but from much smaller ones, also from far left groups. So if you see a yellow dot there on your map, head over to forwardobserver.com, join us, become a subscriber, and get the details on what you could be seeing today. All right, with that, let's go ahead and talk about these anti-ICE coalitions. So specifically, I'm going to talk about what's happening in, I guess it's Dublin, California, which is a Bay Area city. And they are some activists, left-wing activists, they're organizing a movement to oppose this possible reopening of a federal prison there for use as an immigration and customs enforcement or ICE detention facility. And they published a call to action. They're going to have a big conference call, kind of a strategy meeting, or lay out how activists can get involved, coming up on the 30th of July. But in this call to action, they point out that activists were successful in closing 3 of these detention centers in Northern California from 2018 to 2023. And they're calling for this campaign against the local prison in Dublin, again, from being reinstated as an ICE detention facility. But I bring this up to point you to the broader trend, which is that activists do continue to organize opposition against both proposed and existing ICE detention centers across the country. Protesters recently disrupted a Portland, Oregon City Council meeting where they're demanding that the city revoke the permit for that facility there. They've been doing that for a while. Also over in Chicago, Illinois, they held a press conference this week, also demanding that local officials shut down their local ICE facility. And I just want to point out, whenever you talk about these protests and activist groups, they do make demands. That's kind of their big thing, is we're out here, we're showing you the power of numbers, and we want these demands met. Well, if those demands aren't met, historically, typically, that leads to an escalation of tactics. So again, we're moving from mostly toothless but persistent protests into selective resistance, which is going to be direct action, civil disobedience, stuff like that. Fairly low level, still activist activity, nothing overtly violent, at least from the main effort. But of course, we will absolutely continue to see violence against ICE personnel, maybe violence against ICE facilities as well. So I advise everyone to be familiar with both the public and private detention centers in your area. If you go to the ICE website, I have a link in this morning's report for Forward Observer members. I give you that link where they list out all their facilities, and you can search it by state. Also, there are a lot of activists in these NGO groups that have various tracking projects of their own. There's a map here that you can check out, and I provide that group there in this morning's report, along with a link to this map and where you can find out additional information. So look at where you live, and if there's a blue or a red dot, maybe spend 5 or 10 minutes today checking out exactly where that is. And then the next step would be to determine your risk by looking, is there far left activity in my area? Is there kind of more mainstream progressive protests and activist groups in my area? If so, make note of that. All this stuff should be in your area study anyway. And with that, let's go ahead and move on to, speaking of disruption, Robert, so we saw House Speaker Mike Johnson closed down the House a week early to go into August recession. I think that's what they call it. So basically the House is closed for business a week early. And it really does look like this Democrat strategy of pushing Epstein is the reason why he did that, correct?
Correct. And this really started with the cancellation of a scheduled vote that was supposed to happen today in the House Appropriations Committee on one of those 12 must-pass spending bills that are due by the end of September. And originally, the committee was going to hold the vote and said the Republicans said they were going to do it even if the Democrats were going to continue bringing up these Epstein amendments. But from what I understand, Democrats on the committee then said they were going to bring these amendments up for vote, and the vote was canceled, I think almost immediately after. And there have been some senior Democrat aides that talking to media, anonymously saying that this is a deliberate strategy because Democrats see it as an easy way to drag down President Trump in opinion polling and then create chaos among Republican lawmakers. And from what I understand, that this originated with Rep. Ro Khanna, a California Democrat, because he told Democrats, that House Democrats, that this issue was quote unquote kryptonite for Trump. And I think what's happening here is they're in the near term, they're trying to repeat their success from earlier this year, where they were creating these viral moments at Republican town halls, and this pushed Republicans to end those in-person town halls. And I think in the longer term, especially talking about these spending bills, Democrats are still trying to figure out a strategy to force Republicans to engage in a bipartisan process and minimize the amount of spending cuts they can pass. And I think this is also part of that strategy to get these spending bills, basically give them a tighter timeline to force Republicans to negotiate with Democrats to get these bills passed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and by the way, it's August recess, so I misspoke there. But anyway, all right, it's 6 weeks long, and they're out 1 week early, correct?
Correct.
All right, so when they come back, they're going to have this big bevy of, what would you say, 11 spending bills that they have to pass by the end of the month?
12. I think 2 have already gotten out of committee and are either passed or already ready to vote on the House floor. But there's at least 10 of these 12 bills that have not made it out of committee. And I think Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer has been making some comments on basically urging Republicans to not break from Democrats on these must-pass spending bills to try to minimize the amount of impoundments and rescissions, which is basically cutting federal spending that has already been passed, or allowing the Trump administration to not spend that money. And in order to do that, they are also trying to disrupt these must-pass bills to make it so that there's only maybe a less than a month amount of time in order to actually get them passed before they're due on 30 September.
Mm-hmm. This is unfortunate for fortunate or unfortunate, I guess, which side of the fence you're on. But, there was supposed to be a committee hearing on, I forget what bill it is, but it was going to force the U.S. Treasury Department and some other departments and agencies to produce a report on how China could attack the United States economically, financially, monetarily, basically identify where those big risk areas are. And I'm really looking forward to this act passing, because I would love to see that report from Treasury. I'm sure we'll hear about it at some point. I don't know how long it's going to take them to produce that, but I'm a little disappointed that we're not going to see any movement on that, this week, because they were supposed to talk about it this week. All right. The other thing too is, Robert, I think Ro Khanna is fairly accurate about this. I've seen one part of the MAGA movement kind of more or less side with Trump and say, you know what? Let's move on from Epstein. We don't want it. This is old news. Why are people still talking about this guy? Which was like the Streisand effect on steroids. The Streisand effect is where you try to hide or obscure something, and people see that you're trying to hide it, and they say, "Oh, why are you hiding it?" And then it becomes a much bigger deal, like that CEO at the Coldplay concert. The video. I don't know. That was a thing for 15 minutes, if you remember that. At any rate. And then I see the other side of the Trump base saying, what's the point of voting for Republicans? We voted for Trump. We voted for Republicans because we thought we were going to get some justice, finally some action against the elites, and however you want to describe that. And now it looks like it's not going to happen. And they just throw their hands up and say, what's the point? I mean, what is the point of going out and campaigning and donating money if the status quo is not going to be upended? And I realized, just looking at the first 6 months of the Trump administration, he's actually racked up a lot of wins. Actually, Politico just admitted yesterday, they're like, yeah, actually, Trump's first 6 months in office have had a huge number of wins, but they started talking about polling, how Americans don't see it that way. But it actually is true. At any rate, Robert, my question to you is, how do you see this sizing up? And do you think Ro Khanna is right that this actually is kryptonite? And maybe this is one reason why Republicans lose the House is just because a lot of Trump voters stay home because they're angry about this.
Yeah, I think Kana's right that this is a very successful wedge issue for Democrats. Because that recent polling that you mentioned saw something like a 40-point change, I think, in the 18 to 29 demographic for Trump. I think it was like 54% supported Trump for the first 6 months of this year, and then it dropped to something like, I think, 15 or 20 maybe support in the same poll just recently, like this last week. I think the big reason why it has been successful is we discussed before the Pam Bondi binder incident, which was a major misstep. And I think a lot of people were disappointed that we went from Bondi saying that they're reviewing the files, it's on her desk. They had this big binder, promotional event at the White House to a very sudden 180 saying, well, that files don't even exist now. And like you said, it has had a Streisand effect where I think if they had just quietly not addressed this or not did the complete 180, maybe the polling effect and this what might be a schism among the MAGA base wouldn't have happened.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I would also note that a federal judge, I think it was yesterday, blocked the DOJ's request to unseal some of those grand jury documents that Attorney General Pam Bondi had requested. I don't know where that's going or what. I just want to point out a federal judge blocked the release of it, and I didn't even take time to read the article. It's just so insane. Did you happen to see that by any chance?
I did see that they denied the request, and I didn't see what the justification was, but it could have been similar to the reason why the Trump DOJ gave for not just unilaterally releasing the Epstein files, that there is some intent to protect victims, Epstein and Maxwell's victims.
Mm-hmm. One thing I was thinking, we see this stuff all the time, and we've literally seen these reports from the Director of National Intelligence, and it is a summation. It's not all the nitty gritty raw details. It is a summation of previously classified information, reports. I mean, we just saw this earlier this month when they rehashed that 2016 thing with what happened at the CIA with John Brennan and Director Comey at FBI. I wonder why. Maybe they would just be throwing fuel on the fire, but why couldn't DOJ just issue something like a 20 or 40, 100-page report or whatever, hitting the high points, protecting the victims, but also explaining to the American people exactly what went on? Maybe not that. Maybe that's a really bad idea. It would probably cause a lot more questions than answers. But yeah, we'll leave it there. But Robert, is there any reason why DOJ just couldn't do that to kind of assuage the Trump base?
Well, I think when it were specifically for the grand jury documents, that might have to do with the authority of judges to be able to seal legal, the legal proceedings from public view, and that maybe the DOJ thinks that just releasing even a summarized version of any of that information might get on the wrong side of the court.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Two other points here. Yeah, I saw where CNN yesterday came and said, "Oh, Trump was confirmed at the birthday party of Jeffrey Epstein." Just like creating a lot of smoke. And it's like, oh, really? A billionaire went to another billionaire's birthday party. Imagine that, number one. Also, yeah, Clark brings up a great point. DOJ has confirmed that Trump is somewhere in the Epstein files, but we don't know. And of course, there's a lot of smoke being made about why he's in there. But it's not outside the realm of possibility that billionaires rub elbows at birthday parties or functions and events. And, maybe Trump is in there tangentially, not criminally. But I guess we'll never know, unfortunately, or at least not yet. We'll leave it there. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on. We've got one more item to cover here over on the global side. And that is these THAAD missiles, the terminal high altitude air defense weapons. Jared, looks like China's export restrictions, you say, are going to highly affect us from replenishing our THAAD stocks, which at least partially depleted during this last round of Israel and Iran trading attacks.
Yeah. So, a couple of quick stats. According to the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, they estimate that the U.S. used about 14% of its total interceptor inventory just defending Israel in June, which is a lot. That's a huge portion for like a couple days worth of fighting.
Mhm.
Now, the THAAD interceptor uses an indium antimonide infrared seeker, which is to say that the device that actually allows the missile to hit its target is made up of indium and antimony. Antimony is where we're going to focus here. China is the world's largest antimony producer, and recently they banned, just in I think it was 2024, it banned exports of antimony, and we've been covering all year that they've been cracking down on smuggling transit shipments through third-party nations to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So China's doing its best to make sure we do not get antimony, not at least not from them. Now, I think China's export restrictions here are likely to prevent the United States from replenishing that 14% loss of THAAD interceptors without significant cost increases. Not to say that it's completely not doable, we're not going to get them, but just it's going to cost way more than what it previously did. Now, while China is not the sole miner and refiner of antimony, it is far and away the largest of both. It's the largest miner, it is the largest refiner, not even close on the rest of them. Per the U.S. Geological Survey, the U.S. has no active mines or refiners and only recycled antimony for its domestic production. So basically, go through, find out what was there, and then recycle it. And a lot of that goes to lead acid batteries for cars as well. So these THAAD missile batteries are going to be competing for basically just automotive parts. Now, the U.S. will have to compete for a much smaller pool of available material to continue producing the seekers for these interceptors, or just replace the seeker type. Either of those options are going to drive down production numbers and potentially drive up the cost of each missile in the short term. Now, the U.S. does have a reserve of antimony, but it needs that for domestic production of basically anything that requires it, especially those lead acid batteries. If we want to remove the auto manufacturing to the United States, we need that, and it's going to take up a huge portion of those reserves. Ultimately, this demonstrates to China that it can have a significant impact on its main adversary's readiness by playing economic hardball, saying, okay, well, you can't have these materials because we refine them, we mine them, these are ours. And that makes China more ready to move on Taiwan in 2027, because the primary way to intercept a ballistic missile here, you're going to run out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a huge concern. And it really doesn't matter how many THAAD missile batteries we move to the Indo-Pacific. If you run out of rounds, good luck.
Yeah.
Although I have heard, I don't know how true this is, but I did hear from some Army buddies that they have retrofitted or trying to retrofit some artillery rounds to be able to shoot missiles down. That's what they told me. It seems implausible, but not impossible. What say you?
No, totally 100% possible. In fact, likely. We covered that in, I think it was the end of last year. The Navy SWOBOS said something very similar. It was a concept that we had out on the Navy saying, oh yeah, you could technically probably shoot down some of the lesser missiles with the 5-inch gun. And, it's there. And even the 5-inch guys were laughing at that. And then they went almost a 1-for-1 shooting down in the Red Sea. And that's a huge boon to anti-ship missile defense. Because, hey, now the cheapest, easiest round to produce that we carry in the largest numbers you can shoot missiles down with, and it's proven over and over and over. Amazing. It's just I've covered the integration of the Army weapons production and the U.S. Navy weapons production overlapping incredibly. The Typhoon missile system that the Army runs is just taking the Navy VLS and strapping it to a truck. It runs all the same missiles. So which, by the way, eases logistic burden. But yeah, it's entirely believable to me that you take basically a computerized artillery in the Army, and it may not necessarily be as effective as the Navy's, But I mean, that concept is proven. It's just a matter of doing it. Now that is terminal phase. You do not want to be stuck in there, but it is doable.
Yeah. When you say terminal phase, that means it's coming down.
Yeah,
you
like
don't
you
have
can
a lot
see
of time
it.
to
It's
react.
right there.
Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. All right. That's interesting, Jared. Thanks for that. And let's go ahead and move on to some questions because we do have some today. Let's do like maybe the top 2 or 3 questions here.
Okay. Well, quick one.
All right. Who's the author of the Sovereign Individual? Yeah. So that's Davidson and Rees-Mogg. They're 2 British chaps. And there was another question about the Sovereign Individual. I brought this up yesterday, I think. I highly recommend that book. I mean, really, if you have like one book that you're going to read this summer, it should be The Sovereign Individual. If you love history and you like thinking about the future 100%, I think the entire premise of that book, I think, is more likely to be true than not. And the question on that is, do you still agree with the overall sentiment that of the sovereign individual, city-states that might be in a nation, but not necessarily part of that nation, or at least not to the degree we have now? You know, there's been a lot of talk about maybe the balkanization of the United States. Back when we were just a wee print and digital magazine, this was back in 2016, we had an issue looking at that, about how the United States could balkanize. And balkanization is a term, if you're unfamiliar with it. It's about how you have and it's kind of 2 things, but basically you have the Ottoman Empire in the Balkan Peninsula breaking up into these specific ethnic countries. And we can look at Yugoslavia as another example. It was Yugoslavia. Now it's, I don't know, 5 or 6, 7 or something different countries, maybe more. And so it is not outside the realm of possibility that if you subscribe to the belief that the United States is an empire, and if you believe that the United States is nearing the end of its time horizon as that empire, then something is going to happen to it. And typically empires do break apart. Not always. You look at Great Britain as a really good example, / the UK, the British Empire, which ended within a decade after World War II. And they're still around, but they're not so great anymore. But I look at the United States and I just see, we have these red states and quote unquote blue states, which are really just big blue cities in an otherwise red state. And I don't think that's outside the realm of possibility. It is worth entertaining. So the point of this book is that eventually they say the nation state is going away because of debt crises. Debt crises do tend to lead to some form of state breakdown. And that's exactly what this book says. Basically, these countries are being so burdened at the same time when you are having a rapid technological advancement. And eventually, tech is going to win out over the nation state. And as a result, you will get these, the book kind of describes it like almost like a tech utopia, an enclave or a city state. And I think that probably will happen. I know that will happen to some degree because you can look at what Balaji is doing with the network state and some of these kind of libertarian projects like in Latin America and some places in Europe and other places. And I do think it already is happening. And you know what we ought to do? Let me see if I can get Balaji for an interview, and let's talk about the network state, what replaces the nation state as we know it today, and what a digital state with physical ground, physical space or boundaries really looks like. And maybe I can pull some guts out of the sovereign individual and go over that as well. Extremely fascinating topic. It probably is the future of, I think it is the future of the West as we know it. The West will obviously not be as large as it has been in the 20th century. But let's talk a lot more about that later. All right, Jared, what are some other questions here? NGOs seem to operate with a tacit approval and sometimes funding of our elected government, like a shadow government. Is this a potentially subversive mode of governing? Yeah, of course it is. You have Gene Sharp's book, and he says very explicitly, and this book is called From Dictatorship to Democracy. It's worth a read if you're interested in left-wing resistance and popular revolutionary movements. it's a must read, at least just for kind of baseline understanding here. But this is something that Gene Sharp says. He says there's basically there's three prerequisites for launching some color revolution, and one of those is having NGOs that are capable of building resistance or revolutionary campaigns. And you look at the United States and you ask yourself, does the United States have non-governmental organizations? Whether they get government funding or they get private funding, it does not matter. You have these private organizations. Do they have leaders capable of building resistance or revolutionary campaigns? Are they capable of building a strategy to foment revolution in the United States? We already know they do this abroad. We just covered, a few weeks ago, there was that Notice article about current and former USAID and State Department officials basically saying, "Oh, I got fired, so we're instead of working to undermine some foreign government that we don't like, we're just going to do it here in the United States." That's effectively what they said. So this is not a conspiracy, or it's not a conspiracy theory, it's a conspiracy fact. This actually is happening. So is this a potentially subversive mode of governing? Yes, this is the origin of the shadow government. That would be the next step, is to build a shadow government or a government in waiting. And just brief, I've covered this so many times, but just briefly, when you get to that kind of the pinnacle, when you're actually launching your popular revolution or your color revolution, first of all, it lasts a matter of weeks to months. These things are, when they actually get launched, they tend to happen a lot more quickly than, say, like an insurgency or armed revolution, especially. And why is that? It's because they attack the government. They're not trying to attack civilians. They're not trying to attack the military. They're undermining the three pillars of a government, and that's legitimacy, authority, and capacity. And when you undermine the legitimacy of a government, and the people believe that a government is no longer legitimate, the next logical conclusion is that it has to be replaced with a government that is legitimate. And that's what that shadow government or government in waiting is. And if you attack the authority, then you attack essentially that government's ability, or that government's authority, the law. You undermine the law, and you say, well, if the government is illegitimate and they're trying to enforce these laws, then these laws are also illegitimate because they're immoral or whatever, they're illegal, whatever, however that authority is attacked. And when the people no longer obey the authority of a government, then it's not much of a government anymore. And finally, they attack the capacity, which is the funding, the money, the resources, the manpower. A government can make all the laws that it wants, but it's got to have people to enforce those laws. And if a government does not have the capacity to enforce the law, then they have no authority effectively because they can't enforce the law. And a government that can't enforce the laws that it makes because no one respects the laws does not have any legitimacy. So this thing is like a house of cards that just tumbles in on itself. And that's why these color revolutions are historically more successful, I think, than insurgencies, just in terms of base rate of success. So to answer your question, Ben, the answer is yes. All right, any other questions here? Is anyone else concerned? This is a Robert question. Concerned about about evolving at a pace beyond control. I ask this in terms of AI weaponized by our adversaries, like AI bioengineering, guided unmanned drones, etc. Robert, we've heard from some of these AI CEOs that said Americans in the world, they're just not ready for how rapidly AI is going to remake society. And I hear arguments on both sides. But I would tend to believe these AI CEOs who know about what's in development that we haven't even seen yet. But what say you?
Yeah, I think it is concerning, especially we talked yesterday about that massive cyber attack that is still happening right now. And a lot of these people, including some experts from OpenAI, have pointed out that could make it easy. I think the biggest concern here is they would make things like cyber attacks or like what was mentioned, the AI bioengineering. It could make the ability of threat actors to discern new targets and vulnerabilities much more dangerous, because they have effectively a much higher level of surveillance and reconnaissance they can conduct, because they can just send out AI models, or use AI models to search databases and et cetera, and look for these types of vulnerabilities. So it makes it much more difficult to actually defend against them.
Mm-hmm. Robert, wouldn't the opposite of that be true also? Is if we have the world's leading AI, then they can just run our code or our security vulnerabilities through AI. And then if you've identified the security vulnerability, you patch it.
I would hope so. But apparently, at least some of the AI people actually developing this AI, they're much more concerned about about threat actors finding those vulnerabilities. And that might have to do with just the difference in the level of funding and personnel, tied to offensive versus defensive cyber operations.
Mm-hmm. Let me just point out also that historically, the most effective cyber attacks have had a physical component, an actor on the inside. And so AI-enabled cyber attacks, I guess AI and physically enabled cyber attacks, it really makes you wonder about how many foreign nationals there are working in sensitive U.S. industries, and their ability to maybe physically create some of those access points that AI, may have identified previously, but it's been reopened by a human. I don't know. I'll give you the last word on that.
No, I think that's also the physical aspect is important, and that was highlighted by that recent story of Microsoft using Chinese subcontractors. I imagine there's a lot of that still going on that just hasn't been discovered yet.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. All right, thanks for that, Robert. That's going to do it for us here on the Early Warning Briefing. We appreciate your support. Head over to forwardobserver.com. If you like what we do, you want more of it, forwardobserver.com. Join us for a free 7-day trial. We are starting to load up our new website. We're at initial operating capacity now. We continue to bring members over from, if you're early warning network folks, stand by. We're still working on bringing you over, but we'll get you over there. And then we'll launch in earnest. So we appreciate your support, everyone. We'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.